In Salt Lake City, crossing the Vance line doesn't just end your career, it marks the beginning of a living nightmare. My sister Tessa Graham was a 34-year-old data analyst with eyes like sharpened flint and a soul made of iron. She had spent years in the shadows of the server rooms documenting the rot of a toxic dynasty. The VIP lounge doors hadn't even settled when the CEO's son moved in, a predator hunting in broad daylight. He had a terrified intern pinned against the cold steel of the mainframe, his posture radiating the sick confidence of a man who thought he bought the world. I saw her hands tremble. I heard her tablet shatter on the floor. Most people would have kept walking to save their skin, but Tessa stepped in with a silence that cut deeper than a scream. She didn't shout. She didn't waver. She simply stood between the hunter and his prey, and the room turned to ice. When he sneered that his father owned every soul in the building and threatened to have her thrown to the curb, Tessa just tilted her head. She waited for his laughter to rot in his throat before leaning in. She whispered one name, Aspen. The blood didn't just leave his face, it deserted him. In a heartbeat, the prince of the city looked like a ghost in a dead man's suit. He thought he was a god, but he forgot that my sister held the digital keys to his hell. Watch Tessa Graham burn the Vance empire to the ground in 15 minutes of pure high-stakes justice. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's time to take back what was stolen. Watching Sterling retreat with that ghostly pallor was a temporary high, but it couldn't erase a decade of wreckage. My father, Marcus Graham, was a visionary whose encryption core should have secured our family's legacy for generations. He made one fatal mistake. He trusted Arthur Vance, a man who traded his soul for market share long ago. Arthur didn't just buy the tech. He used predatory NDAs and legal traps to strip my father of every patent he owned. I still remember the day the bailiffs arrived, the beginning of a long, slow fade for my parents. Marcus never recovered. He spent his final years staring at a screen, while the world hailed Arthur as a pioneer of the industry he stole. Tessa didn't waste years weeping in the corners of our cramped apartment. She disappeared into the world of high-stakes data science fueled by a cold, calculating rage. Working 20-hour days under an alias, she became the elite analyst. The very people she hated now clamored to hire. Her return to Salt Lake City wasn't luck. It was a surgical infiltration of the Vance corporate heart. She spent 5 grueling years sharpening her blade so she'd never have to walk in as a victim seeking charity. Every line of code she mastered was another brick in the wall of Arthur's eventual prison. The air inside headquarters grew suffocating every time we crossed the shadows of our father's past. One afternoon, Tessa froze when she saw Silas, our father's former partner, now a high-ranking director, under Arthur's thumb. He wore a $1,000 suit bought with the blood money of his betrayal. When he offered a patronizing greeting, Tessa looked through him like he was a glitch in a broken system. She didn't give him the dignity of an argument. She just walked past her silent, screaming louder than any confrontation. At night, when the skyscraper was empty and the guards were distracted, the real work began. Tessa used her senior access to bury monitoring algorithms deep within the company's financial spine. These weren't just tools, they were scalpels designed to flag every dime Sterling stole to cover his gambling debts and sins. I stood watch, my heart hammering against my ribs as she tore through encrypted layers of hidden ledgers. Every discovery brought us closer to the truth. Arthur was cooking the books to keep his son's criminal life afloat. Tessa played the part of the humble, quiet employee to perfection, never questioning the status quo. She endured the condescending remarks of junior execs with a level of patience that was honestly terrifying. She smiled at the very people she planned to hand over to the feds in a matter of weeks. Our mother, Sarah, was the only one who truly knew the weight Tessa carried on her shoulders. During a quiet dinner, Tessa took our mother's weathered hands and made a solemn, sacred vow. She promised the Graham name would be restored, and our father's genius would no longer be a footnote in a thief's biography. Mom didn't ask for revenge, but she nodded, knowing only justice could bring peace to my father's ghost. That night, the air felt heavy with a single truth: the storm had arrived, and the Vance empire was already shaking. 3 weeks before the scheduled boardroom meeting, my sister's close friend Elias Thorne waited for us inside a dusty, abandoned warehouse located on the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. Elias was a brilliant private investigator who had spent years operating in the gray areas of corporate intelligence where traditional law enforcement often failed to reach. The flickering overhead lights cast long, jagged shadows across the scattered computer monitors and stacks of decrypted documents that filled his makeshift workspace. Tessa greeted him with a sharp, professional nod that signaled the beginning of their most dangerous collaboration to date. Elias had successfully cracked the encrypted audio files related to the Aspen Resort incidents that Sterling Vance had fought so desperately to bury a decade ago. We listened in heavy silence as the voices of terrified young women filled the cold air, documenting how Sterling used his family's influence to silence his victims with brutal efficiency. These recordings were the missing pieces of a puzzle that Tessa had been meticulously assembling since she first stepped back into the Vance corporate headquarters. Elias provided a thick stack of legal settlement papers that proved Arthur Vance had authorized millions of dollars in hush money to protect his son's stained reputation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the sheer scale of the corruption that had allowed these men to remain untouchable for so long. Tessa didn't flinch at the graphic details, but her jaw tightened with a renewed sense of purpose that made her appear almost statuesque in the dim light. She began cross-referencing these names with the current employee roster, looking for anyone who might still be trapped under Sterling's predatory thumb. The next evening, Tessa arranged a series of quiet, off-site meetings with Hazel and several other women who had been recently targeted by Sterling's erratic behavior. She didn't approach them with empty promises of comfort, but instead offered them a concrete path toward collective justice and professional liberation. I watched from a distance as she spoke to them with a calm authority that seemed to steady their trembling hands and clear their tear-filled eyes. She explained that the only way to break the cycle of abuse was to stand together before the board of directors as a unified, undeniable force of truth. Most of these women were initially paralyzed by the fear of losing their livelihoods, yet Tessa's unwavering confidence eventually acted as a bridge to their buried courage. They began to realize that their silence was the only thing truly protecting the men who had treated them like disposable property. While Elias focused on the criminal aspect of the investigation, Tessa spent her late nights deep within the company's internal financial architecture. She utilized her senior analyst credentials to trace the complex digital footprints of the massive cryptocurrency transfers Sterling frequently initiated from the corporate accounts. These weren't just simple business transactions, but a deliberate siphoning of company assets to fund a lifestyle of reckless extravagance and illegal gambling debts. Tessa carefully triage the metadata from these transfers, proving that Sterling had been bypassing traditional oversight protocols for months. She compiled a comprehensive dossier of every unauthorized withdrawal, creating a digital trail that led directly to Sterling's private offshore wallets. This financial evidence was intended to be the secondary strike that would ensure Arthur Vance could no longer protect his son without destroying himself in the process. During this period of intense digital scavenging, Elias Thorne discovered a second layer of deception that involved Arthur's direct manipulation of the annual financial reports. He presented us with a series of hidden ledgers that documented how Arthur had been falsifying growth projections to cover up the massive losses incurred by Sterling's failed investment ventures. The elder Vance had essentially been running a sophisticated shell game to maintain the appearance of corporate stability, while the internal foundation was rotting away. Every falsified signature and manipulated spreadsheet was a testament to a father's desperate attempt to preserve a dynasty built on stolen brilliance. Elias confirmed that these documents were sufficient to trigger a full-scale federal investigation that would likely result in multiple felony charges for the entire Vance leadership. The final piece of Tessa's strategic alliance involved establishing a secure encrypted communication channel with the company's largest shareholder, Margot. Margot had long been suspicious of Arthur's opaque management style and his unusual tendency to overlook Sterling's glaring professional incompetence. Tessa reached out to her under the guise of a routine data audit, eventually revealing just enough information to pique the veteran investor's sharp curiosity. They began exchanging messages through an untraceable server, building a foundation of mutual trust that would be essential for the upcoming confrontation in the boardroom. Margot was a woman of immense integrity, who valued the health of the company far more than her personal loyalty to the Vance family name. Having her support meant that Tessa wouldn't just be a disgruntled employee making accusations, but a whistleblower backed by the most powerful voice in the corporation. The atmosphere in our small apartment felt increasingly electric, as the various threads of the investigation began to weave into a suffocating net for our enemies. Tessa spent her few hours of sleep surrounded by glowing screens and printed transcripts, her mind constantly calculating the most effective way to present this mountain of evidence. I assisted her by organizing the physical documents into a strictly chronological order that highlighted the long-term pattern of systemic corruption. We both knew that the Vance family would eventually realize something was wrong, yet the sheer complexity of our alliance kept us one step ahead of their suspicions. Every secret meeting and every decrypted file brought us closer to the moment when the truth would finally collide with the walls of lies they had built. Everything seemed to be moving according to our silent calculations until the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters shifted into something far more predatory. 2 days before the highly anticipated impeachment hearing, Sterling decided to take a reckless gamble. He infiltrated the central server room during the early morning hours, moving with a misguided sense of confidence as he planted a sophisticated strain of malware specifically designed to mimic Tessa's unique coding signature. He intended to frame her for a massive theft of sensitive client data, ensuring that by the time the board met, my sister would be viewed as a common criminal rather than a credible whistleblower. I watched from the shadows of the department hallway as he emerged from the server vault with a smirk. "Enjoy the unemployment line, Tessa," he muttered to the empty corridor, his voice dripping with a perceived victory that made my blood run cold. The hammer fell later that afternoon when Arthur transformed a standard disciplinary action into a public execution of Tessa's reputation. He didn't just summon her, he commanded the entire security detail to intercept her in the middle of the crowded cafeteria. The sight of 4 uniformed guards surrounding a senior analyst during the busiest hour caused a stunned silence to ripple through the room. Arthur stood on the balcony overlooking the dining area, his voice booming like a twisted god. "Tessa Graham, you have betrayed the trust of this firm and the legacy of my family. You are a thief, and you are finished." It was a calculated move to humiliate her so thoroughly that no employee would ever dare associate with her again. She was marched out like a high-profile prisoner, her head held high even as the whispers of shocked colleagues followed her to the glass exit doors. Later that evening, the heavy silence of our small apartment was shattered by a persistent, arrogant pounding. Sterling didn't even wait for an invitation before he shouldered his way inside, looking around our modest living room with a disgusted sneer. "Cozy," he mocked, tossing a thick legal folder onto the coffee table. "Sign these or the next time you see the sun will be through a prison window." The documents required her to admit to the data theft in exchange for the company dropping charges. The catch was absolute: she had to leave Salt Lake City forever and never speak to anyone associated with the Vance Empire again. He leaned against our wall, looking like he already owned the air we breathed. "You Grahams were always losers," he said, lighting a cigarette despite my mother's coughing. "Your father was a failure and you're just a common crook. Take the deal, Tessa. It's the only mercy you're getting." Tessa put on a performance that was so convincing it made my heart ache. She allowed her shoulders to slump and her voice to tremble as she looked up at him with watery eyes. "Please, Sterling," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. "Think about our mother. She can't handle a trial. She's fragile." She played the role of a broken woman who had reached the end of her endurance, sobbing quietly as she reached for the silver pen. Sterling watched her with pure, unadulterated triumph. "That's more like it." He laughed, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Know your place. You're nothing but a footnote in my father's biography." As she scrawled her signature across every single page of the humiliating exit papers, he snatched the folder back with a sharp, jagged laugh. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out of the city. Actually do. It'll be the most interesting thing to happen to you in years." Once the sound of his expensive car faded into the distance, Tessa's expression transformed instantly into a mask of cold, surgical precision. She wiped the moisture from her cheeks and walked over to her hidden laptop. "Did you get it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up, her fingers flying across the keys. "Every second of it. The recording of his confession about framing me is already uploading to the cloud. He just handed us the rope to hang him with." She spent the next several hours finalizing the encrypted data packets containing the evidence Elias Thorne had gathered. These files were the culmination of 5 years of preparation, every bribe, every stolen patent, and every falsified financial report. She handed me a small encrypted flash drive. "Deliver this to the federal building at 8 a.m. sharp," she commanded. "Don't stop for anything." Unknown to Arthur or Sterling, the malware planted earlier was being rerouted into a sophisticated logic trap. Tessa had anticipated their frame-up and established a protocol that would trigger a massive data dump if anyone tried to delete the forged evidence. Every move they made to bury her only served to further entangle them in a digital net connected directly to the authorities. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never considered they were being lured into a carefully constructed cage. The very tools they intended to use for her destruction were now the primary instruments of their downfall. As the night wore on, reports surfaced about a lavish celebration at the Vance estate. "They're drinking champagne, Tessa," I said, looking at the news feed on my phone. "They think they won." Tessa didn't smile. She just looked out the window at the skyline she was about to change forever. "Let them drink," she said, her voice like ice hitting glass. "It's the last thing they'll ever celebrate. Tomorrow the Graham name doesn't just return, it burns the Vance empire to ash." We sat in the dark watching the lights of the city, waiting for the sun to rise on the day of the boardroom meeting. The trap was set. The evidence was in transit, and for the first time in 10 years, we weren't the ones who should be afraid. The sunrise that followed our long night of preparation was cold and unforgiving, casting a clinical light over the city that had once belonged to the Vances. As the clock struck 9, the heavy silence inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom felt like a physical weight. Every high-ranking executive and board member sat in rigid attention, while Arthur Vance adjusted his silk tie with the practiced precision of a man preparing for a coronation. He stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of disappointment that hid the predatory triumph swirling behind his cold blue eyes. Sterling sat beside him, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, looking every bit the prince who had just executed his last rival. Arthur cleared his throat, his voice resonant with faux sorrow. "It is a dark day for this firm." He began, his eyes scanning the room. "We have been forced to remove a cancer from our ranks. Tessa Graham didn't just fail us, she tried to burn our legacy to the ground by stealing the very data that protects our clients. We have the logs, the signatures, and the confession. I move for immediate criminal prosecution." The double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open with a sudden echoing thud that cut Arthur's performance off in mid-sentence. Tessa walked into the room with a calm, unwavering stride that immediately commanded the room. She wasn't alone. She was flanked by Margot, the company's largest shareholder, and a formidable team of legal experts representing the coalition of Sterling's victims. "The only cancer in this room, Arthur," Tessa said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "is the one currently sitting at the head of this table." Arthur's face flushed a deep crimson. "How dare you, security?" Why is this terminated criminal allowed in my sight? Margot didn't even look at him as she pulled out a chair. Sit down, Arthur, she said, her tone freezing. We aren't here for your theater. We're here for the truth. Tessa didn't wait for permission. She activated the room's projection system with a device from her pocket, bypassing the security Arthur thought he controlled. You told this board you invented the Graham core. Tessa stated, her eyes locking onto Arthur's. But data doesn't lie. It just waits. She began displaying original source codes and dated patent applications buried for a decade. The digital timestamps revealed the truth. Arthur had digitally altered the original documents to insert his name over our father's. This is Marcus Graham's soul, she said, pointing to the glowing code. And you are nothing but a common thief who moved into a house he didn't build. The directors leaned forward in shock as the mountain of evidence grew, each slide a relentless hammer blow against the pedestal of lies Arthur had occupied for 10 years. The tension reached a boiling point when Sterling realized the frame-up from 48 hours ago was disintegrating. He stood up so abruptly his chair skittered across the floor, his face twisted in unadulterated rage. You lying bitch! He screamed, his voice cracking with thuggish desperation. You think these losers you brought with you mean anything? Hazel is a nobody. I'll make sure none of you ever work in this industry again. He turned his venom toward Hazel, who stood bravely by the door. Withdraw your statement now, or I'll find you outside this building and make you regret ever being born. The room went deathly silent. Arthur tried to grab his son's arm, whispering frantically, Sterling, shut up. Sit down. But it was too late. Sterling shoved his father's hand away. No, I own this place. My name is on the front of the building. His total lack of self-control was the final piece of evidence the board needed. They weren't looking at a leader. They were looking at a liability. Margot finally stood up, looking at Arthur with profound pity. The building says Vance Sterling, she said quietly, and hung the foundation belongs to the Grahams. She turned to the board, gesturing to the financial records Tessa had just decrypted. Arthur didn't just steal a patent. He enabled a predator. These logs show Sterling siphoning millions into offshore gambling accounts, while Arthur cooked the books to hide the rot. They haven't been leading a company. They've been running a crime syndicate. Arthur's hands began to shake as the legal walls closed in. Margot, listen to reason. He pleaded, his voice now a pathetic rasp. The company will collapse without me. The markets will panic. Margot's gaze was iron. The markets will recover. You won't. I move for an immediate vote to strip Arthur Vance of all voting power and remove both him and his son from this premises, effective immediately. Exactly 15 minutes after the confrontation began, the boardroom shifted from a corporate hearing to a site of absolute judicial reckoning. Tessa locked eyes with Arthur, her gaze carrying a decade of suppressed justice. The master of this tower is officially a squatter. She didn't shout, but the weight of her words shattered the last of his arrogant composure. With a final tap on the console, she activated a hidden video retrieved by Elias Thorne from the Vance estate's private servers. The screen flickered to life, showing a high-definition recording of Sterling laughing as he boasted about framing Tessa. It was too easy, Dad. Sterling's voice echoed through the room. The little analyst actually thought she could play with the big boys. Arthur was seen on screen pouring a glass of vintage scotch while discussing the exact bribes needed to silence federal investigators. Consider this a reward for protecting the family interests, Arthur replied in the video, his smug grin now mirrored by a mask of horror in the boardroom. This was the final nail in their collective coffin, proof that the rot started at the very top and infected every level of their empire. The heavy thud of tactical boots suddenly thundered in the hallway, signaling the arrival of the authorities. Federal agents and Salt Lake City police burst through the double doors, warrants for fraud and aggravated assault in hand. Arthur scrambled toward the emergency exit behind his desk, but a stern-faced agent blocked his path. "Arthur Vance, you are under arrest," the agent declared, pinning the billionaire back into his leather throne. "All personal and corporate assets are officially seized." Sterling tried to bolt for the door, but he was tackled onto the mahogany floor before he could take 3 steps. The sight of the man who once controlled the city's pulse being forced into handcuffs was the definition of poetic justice. Sterling was hauled back into the very chair he had used to mock his victims, his wrists bound in glinting steel. He looked around for support, but every executive who had once laughed at his jokes now looked away in disgust. Arthur slumped forward, his forehead touching the polished table he had used as a weapon for decades. "You can't do this," he whimpered, his voice a pathetic rasp. "I built this city. I am the economy. You built a cage." "Arthur," Tessa replied, standing over the fallen titan. And today, the door locked. The realization that his fortune was frozen and his power was gone seemed to drain the last bit of life from his features. He looked at the empty chair where my father should have sat 10 years ago, finally understanding that his empire was a house of sand. The silence that followed was broken only by the digital ledgers on the screen, still flagging illegal transactions in real time. Tessa turned to the remaining board members, her presence commanding every ounce of their attention. "Your invincibility was an illusion built on fear," she said. "The Graham name was never a footnote. It was the foundation you were too weak to build yourselves." In a final pathetic act of desperation, Arthur tried to whisper a monetary offer to Margot. "Margot, listen," he hissed, unaware his microphone was still hot. "I have offshore accounts, millions. Just get me out of this room." The entire boardroom heard his blatant attempt to bribe his way to freedom. Margot looked at him with such intense disappointment that he finally fell silent, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Your money is as worthless as your word, Arthur," Margot said, her voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. The federal agents began leading the 2 men out, parading them past a long line of employees who had gathered to witness the fall. Sterling kept his head down, his former bravado replaced by a visible, uncontrollable trembling. Arthur walked with a hollow stare, escorted into the private elevator for the very last time. The employees stood in a silence more powerful than any cheer, watching the elevator doors close on the Vance era. The company was finally free to breathe, to rebuild on the honesty they had tried so hard to kill. Tessa turned toward me with a slight weary smile, the smile of someone who had finally finished a marathon. "It's over," she whispered. "The Graham name is clean." As the authorities cleared the room, we stood on the balcony looking out over the Salt Lake skyline Marcus Graham had once dreamed of protecting. The air felt cleaner, the light seemed brighter. We had spent 5 years in their shadow, but now we stood in the warmth of a justice 10 years in the making. We walked toward the exit together, knowing that while their empire had fallen, our family had finally risen. The gavel fell with a heavy, echoing finality inside the Salt Lake City Federal Courthouse, exactly 1 month after the Vance empire began its spectacular public descent. The presiding judge showed no mercy as he read through the felony convictions that guaranteed Sterling and Arthur would spend the next several decades in federal prison. Sterling looked physically diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his former arrogance replaced by a haunted expression, as he realized the American legal system could not be bought. Arthur sat beside him with a vacant stare while the court detailed the systemic financial fraud that funded their unearned luxury. "You built a kingdom on the broken backs of those you deemed insignificant, and today, that kingdom finally burns." The judge stated firmly before the bailiffs led them away in chains. This verdict was the final confirmation that no amount of corporate influence could protect a predator when the truth was presented with such surgical precision. Following the victory, Tessa officially stepped into her role as the new CEO with a mission to rebuild everything they had broken. She didn't waste time moving into the penthouse office, though her first act was to remove every trace of the Vance presence. "The era of fear ends today, And we are going to scrub this place until it's finally clean, Tessa told me, as she watched workers take down Arthur's gold-framed portrait. She established a massive compensation fund for every victim who had been silenced by Sterling's predatory behavior over the years. Margot supported her every move, acting as a steady mentor, while they transformed the corporate culture into a workplace defined by safety. We aren't just changing the letterhead Margot, we are changing the DNA of this institution, Tessa remarked during their first strategy session. The employees who once lived in fear now walked the hallways with a sense of pride that hadn't existed there for a generation. During the transition, a team of high-priced defense lawyers representing the Vance estate approached our family with multiple offers for an out-of-court settlement. They promised us millions of dollars in exchange for a public statement that would minimize Arthur's direct involvement in the intellectual property theft. Tessa didn't even bother to read the terms before she firmly rejected every proposal with absolute conviction. Justice is not a commodity that you can purchase with the blood-stained remnants of a stolen fortune, she told the lead attorney, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The lawyer tried to argue about a quiet resolution, but Tessa simply pointed toward the door with a cold, lethal smile. Her refusal sent a message to the business community that the Graham family was interested in systemic change rather than financial retribution. We had survived their cruelty, and no amount of hush money could compensate for 10 years of suffering. The most emotional moment occurred when the Federal Patent Office officially restored the intellectual property rights to our father, Marcus Graham. Seeing his name printed on the original algorithm documents felt like watching a long-buried wound finally heal under the warm light of the sun. Margot squeezed my hand as the official papers were signed, whispering that our father would have been incredibly proud of the resilient women we had become. We spent the weekend moving our belongings back into our old family home, the place where our father first drafted the code that changed the industry. The house felt smaller than I remembered, yet it was filled with a peace that had been missing since the night we were forced to leave. Our mother sat in the garden, her eyes bright with joy as she watched the sunset. "We are finally home, girls," she whispered, her voice trembling with the relief of a decade-long burden being lifted. Under the unified leadership of Tessa and Margot, the corporation was officially rebranded to reflect its commitment to transparency. The Vance name was scrubbed from the facade, replaced by a title that honored the collective effort of the whistleblowers who dared to speak up. Margot ensured the board was filled with individuals who prioritized sustainability over the short-term greed that nearly destroyed the firm's reputation. "We aren't just building software anymore. We are rebuilding professional trust," Tessa announced during her first official address to the shareholders. Her presence in the boardroom was no longer a symbol of defiance, but a testament to the power of resilience and standing one's ground. The reality of their downfall was emphasized by how society instantly erased Sterling from the social circles he had once dominated. He faced the harsh reality of federal incarceration, where his family name carried no weight and his father's money could no longer shield him. People who once sought Sterling's approval now acted as if they had never heard his name, leaving him to face his punishment in isolation. The strictness of the legal system ensured that every act of harassment was met with a proportional response, reflecting his crimes. He was finally seeing himself through the eyes of the public, stripped of the illusions that had protected his ego for far too long. As the sun set on our first night back in our home, Tessa and I sat on the porch. "I used to think revenge was about making them suffer," I admitted. Tessa smiled with a quiet strength. "It's not, Amber. True revenge is taking back the life they tried to delete and making it better than they ever could," she replied. "We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the architects of a new era. Our father's legacy was secure, our mother was happy, and the people who tried to destroy us were finally facing accountability. The shadow of the Vance family was gone, and the Graham name was finally shining with the brilliance it deserved." Looking back at the grueling journey we have endured over the past decade, I finally realize that true revenge is never found in violence or petty destruction. The most profound victory occurs when the villains are forced to witness the absolute success and happiness of the very people they once tried to destroy. Every morning that Tessa walks into her office as a respected leader serves as a living reminder of the failure of the Vance family's cruelty. They didn't just fail to break us, Amber. They gave us the tools to build something unbreakable, Tessa remarked while we sat on our porch overlooking the city. We didn't just survive their attempts to erase us, but we thrived and built something far more beautiful from the wreckage of their lies. Standing in our original family home today, I feel a sense of accomplishment that has nothing to do with frozen bank accounts or prison sentences. It is the simple, quiet triumph of reclaiming a life that was stolen and proving that our worth was never defined by their arrogant opinions. Tessa often shares with me that the secret to our eventual success didn't lie in the pursuit of power or the accumulation of stolen wealth. She believes that true influence is born from a relentless commitment to protecting the right values, even when the entire world seems to be working against you. Arthur forgot that you can't own the truth no matter how much money you throw at it, she noted during our last conversation about the trial. She refused to lower herself to the level of the Vances, choosing instead to use the truth as her primary instrument of change. Her journey has taught me that power obtained through deception is a fragile illusion that will eventually shatter under the weight of its own dishonesty. We watched a multi-billion-dollar empire crumble in weeks because its foundation was built on the suffering of others rather than genuine innovation. Tessa's leadership at the rebranded firm is now a testament to the idea that integrity is the only sustainable currency in a modern professional world. This entire ordeal has been a powerful affirmation that in an American society dedicated to the rule of law, no individual can stand above the truth forever. Arthur Vance believed that his connections and his vast fortune made him untouchable by the common standards of justice and morality. He learned the hard way that the legal system eventually catches up to those who treat other human beings as disposable tools for their own advancement. The courtroom doesn't care about your silk ties or your rooftop boardrooms when the evidence is written in black and white, Margot added during a recent visit. The federal investigators and the court did not care about his family name once the evidence of his crimes became undeniable. Our story serves as a beacon of hope for anyone who feels like they are fighting a losing battle against a powerful and corrupt opponent. It proves that the mechanisms of justice are designed to protect the vulnerable, provided they have the courage to bring the truth into the light. The most important lesson I want everyone to take away from our struggle is to never underestimate the silence of a person who is currently suffering. That silence isn't a sign of weakness or submission, but it is often the quiet preparation for a massive storm of justice that will eventually sweep away the oppressors. Tessa remained silent for years while she gathered the evidence and built the alliances necessary to dismantle the Vance dynasty with surgical precision. I wasn't hiding, Amber. I was observing every single crack in their armor, she told me with a knowing smile. She allowed her enemies to believe they had won, so that they would become complacent and leave behind the digital footprints that led to their downfall. The people you think you have crushed are often the ones who are most diligently working to ensure that you never have the chance to hurt anyone else. Strength is not always found in loud shouting, but in the steady and calculated persistence of someone who knows they are on the right side of history. The incredible solidarity between Tessa and the marginalized victims like Hazel created an unstoppable force that was capable of toppling an entire corporate empire. They proved that when the vulnerable stand together and refuse to be intimidated by wealth, they possess a power that no tyrant can ever overcome. We were just sparks alone, but together we became the fire that burned their lies down, Hazel whispered during the rebranding ceremony last week. The Vance family relied on keeping their victims isolated and afraid of each other, but they were powerless once those women began sharing their stories. This collective courage turned a group of survivors into a formidable army of witnesses that the board of directors could no longer ignore. It reminds us all that we are never truly alone in our struggles if we are willing to reach out and support those facing the same shadows. I want to offer my most sincere gratitude to every single one of you who has listened to my sister's story until these final and dramatic moments. Your presence and your attention have given us a platform to ensure that the truth about the Graham family and the Vance Tower is known. It has been a long and emotional road to walk, but knowing that our experiences might help someone else find their own strength has made every sacrifice worthwhile. Your support turned our private pain into a public victory for everyone, Tessa said, looking directly into the camera as we filmed this final update. We have shared the most intimate details of our pain and our triumph because we believe that stories have the power to change minds and inspire real-world action. Your support has been a source of incredible comfort to us as we worked to reclaim our father's legacy and rebuild our lives from the ground up. We truly value your companionship on this journey, and we are very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives in the comments section below. Please share your own experiences of standing up against injustice, or tell us what part of Tessa's journey resonated with you the most during these chapters. Your voice is an essential part of the conversation we are trying to start about corporate ethics and the protection of vulnerable employees. We hope that this story serves as a reminder that no one is truly untouchable and that the truth will always find a way to emerge. Thank you once again for standing with the Graham family and for being a witness to the final collapse of a corrupt empire and the rise of a new era. We look forward to reading your reflections and continuing this important discussion about justice and the power of the human spirit.